this is What's Up With That? And this is Thursday, December 19th. We're talking about close encounters, and this is session 7, actually. So we just did 6, and this will be 7. It's mislabeled there, but I'll change it. And now we're going to talk about some examples of close encounters that are in other countries. So we talked about these close encounters in the U.S., in Exeter, New Hampshire, and New Jersey, and we talked about some like that. And we talked about some of these things that tie them together, you know, the traces, multiple witnesses, statistical pooling, and radar. So now let's talk about some things that happen in other countries. So if you want to catch us, we're at YouTube on a channel called Krishna Was Up, KRISHNAWAZZUP. And we're here every Thursday from about 7 to 8:30. Between 7 to 8:30, we're at 26 2nd Avenue. But we won't have another session until January 9th because it's the holidays and I have a lot of stuff. So we're not going to do anything for that time. Now, we're moving into the second half of today's discussion here. This is Via Santina, Italy. And this is a very early UFO encounter. So some of the more earliest ones date back to the 40s. We have the famous Missouri encounter in Cape Girardeau, where a minister was called to perform last rites for aliens that were killed in a UFO crash. We have this thing that happened in Via Santina, Italy. And of course, we have Kenneth Arnold's famous, account that goes back to about that time too. We talked about that last week. So in this case, the person who saw the UFOs is Rapuzzi Luigi Johannes. And this Via Santina, Italy, I think is up in the upper northern end of Italy. And he is an artist and actually a sci-fi writer too. So you can think, well, maybe he just made this whole thing up. But this is 47. This is way before the whole UFO phenomenon was actually known by anybody or evaluated by anybody. But already, people were very reluctant to come forward, knowing that it might put their reputation completely in the, deep hole. So the way that it's described by Rapuzzi, he tried to write up his story. And he gave it to several different periodicals or news magazines, and no one would print it. But finally, he wound up finding someone that would print it, and he paid for it himself. And he says he saw what he thought were boys. But upon closer inspection, he realized that they weren't boys, that they were actually small humanoids, and he described the clothes they were wearing. And he saw this round object. He went up to the round object and he saw these boys in a nearby area. And as he walked over to them, he was actually doing some geological stuff. He's evidently a geologist as well, so he was picking through some rocks. He had a pickaxe in his hand, and he saw these boys, and he waved the pickaxe at them, and one of them reached for his belt, and the next thing he knew, he felt this paralyzing ray, and he was on the ground, and he couldn't move. And he saw the boys walk over and take the pickaxe from him. And then he couldn't move still, and he saw the craft apparently just zip away very, very quickly. So that was his encounter, So This is something we hear a lot, description of the aliens, how they had very strange-looking features, very small nose, very small mouth, big eyes. Interesting thing we see a lot of, too, is this sudden departure, that the craft either is able to accelerate very quickly, or it appears it just disappears. It's there, and then it disappears. And at this same time, there were other people in that same area who also apparently saw this craft. And, Newark Valley, New York, this is another close to home, 1964. Here the investigators, Berthold Schwarz, who is as we said, a psychologist. And the person that saw this particular thing is a person named Gary Wilcox. He was a dairy farmer. And he was working in his field, and he saw what he thought at first was some kind of fuel tank from an aircraft, and he went over to it, and he saw some small beings that apparently spoke to him, but he said they didn't really seem to talk. He could just kind of understand what they were saying. In some kind of telepathic way. So this is something that we do hear a lot of, that in many of these encounters, there's communication between these aliens and the person involved. And in this case, the aliens, because he was a farmer, they asked him about fertilizer and about growing. And the aliens claimed to be from Mars. They may or may not have actually been from Mars. That's the thing we don't know. When supposedly aliens are communicating with us, are they telling the truth? We don't know. And they actually asked him about various growing techniques, and they wanted to see some fertilizer. So the next day he brought a bag of fertilizer and put it in the location where he had seen them. And the day after, he noticed the fertilizer was gone. So evidently they came and checked it out. So at any rate, this Berthold Schwarz did a battery of psychological tests on our Gary Wilcox, who was just a dairy farmer. He wasn't anyone special. He'd never been interested in UFOs. That's the interesting thing about this kind of thing, that generally speaking, many people are interested, and they become affected by the UFO phenomenon, but they were never previously either believers or even interested in the phenomenon, but suddenly it just kind of reaches out to them. So this is Villares de Saz in Spain, and the researcher in this case is Antonio Ribera, who is evidently a very famous UFO researcher in Spain and in that part of Europe. And in this case, the person who saw, the person reporting, the witness, is Maximo Munoz Hernaiz. And he's only 14 years old. He's a shepherd boy. And he was watching some animals, cows or sheep, I don't know what they were for sure. And he says that he saw a craft come down, and he saw these beings come out. In this case, the boy claimed that they were about 2 to 3 foot tall, which is not very tall. And he says, the boy says, that they were trying to communicate with him in some kind of way. And there was one on the right of him and one on the left of him and one right in front of him who was talking directly to him. And he couldn't understand what they were saying. And the one in front of him slapped him, evidently because he was frustrated he couldn't communicate with the boy. So after this particular event occurred, they went back and they found holes in the ground where evidently the landing gear was. There were others who saw lights, and they found footprints from these beings that had communicated or tried to communicate with Maximo. And these were not your normal sized footprints. So what do we make of these things? Either it's a very, very clever hoax, and the idea that this shepherd boy, who is illiterate completely, so he's not watching the regular news nor reading UFO accounts of anything, but he comes up with a story that's very similar to many other stories. So here we have this corroborating testimony. And so during that same time, there were other people who saw these same lights and tried to find out something about it, but they couldn't. But this young boy was the only one that actually saw. So in the book, Alien Identities, we hear 2 or 3 more reports by children who see these aliens, and then we wonder why do they... Of course, everyone knows children can make things up. But the problem is that children are notoriously bad liars because they don't know how the world works yet. So if they just say one lie, they could maybe get away with it, but generally children don't stop. They go on and elaborate their story, and as their story gets further and further, it gets more and more unbelievable. So that's how adults can understand that children are lying. But when they come up with a solid story, and they all seem to say something very similar to one another, and some cases where they report the UFO, also other people are reporting a UFO. This is pretty good, high caliber evidential material that shows that this could be something they genuinely did see. So here we have France, Trans-en-Provence in France, 1981. This is February. So the investigator here is Jean-Jacques Velasco, and he's part of GPON, which is the French version of UFO investigating. But in this case, they have a credible scientific following in France, whereas most of this kind of thing is not really followed in any mainstream science in the Western world. But in France, GPON has a pretty good following. So Jean-Jacques Velasco, he investigated this Monsieur Collini. So Monsieur Collini was doing something in his garden. And he saw this craft come down. He looked at it. He didn't see anybody get out. And then it took off again. So when he reported it to the gendarme, the police, they came and they noticed some marks. And later on, about 29 days later, they notified GPON, who came to investigate it. And this is some of the scientific tests that GPON did on the area, that evidently the ground had shown evidence of having been heated from 300 to 600 degrees, which seems unlikely in a place like somebody's garden. And they noticed that where the craft had actually touched down, that the plant life had withered, that there was changes in the color of the plants, there was changes in the health of the plants, and some of the plants had died. And so this shows that something physical had actually occurred in this unusual place where they found these depressions and markings that there actually had been something there. So the last story I want to touch on here is Betty and Barney Hill, this is a very interesting story, and the more you read about it, the more wild the whole thing really is. These are the first real abductee couple. So evidently Betty and Barney Hill lived in also New Hampshire. And in 1961, they were traveling home from visiting Niagara Falls. And they were driving on a road, and they saw some light in the sky, which at first they thought was a star. Then later on, it appeared to have something more going on. At one point, they pulled over their car and got out their binoculars and started looking at it, and they could see these colored lights. And then somehow or other, they wind up back at their place where they're going to, their home, and they realize all this missing time, hours of missing time. And they remember looking at this revolving light phenomenon. But they don't really know what happened next. But they find themselves back at their house. And they feel very unusual. Something's not right. Now, they saw the lights, so they decided to report that to the U.S. Air Force and NICAP. Back then, people reported to NICAP. And they kind of were a little bit done with that. But what happened was that Betty started to have very strange dreams. Dreams where apparently various aliens were doing something to her. And this bothered her. Barney didn't appear to have any kind of dreams, and he kind of wrote off what was happening with Betty. And they were part of a church. They were part of a church group, and eventually through various contacts, they heard about this Benjamin Simon, who was a hypnotist. Barney had already been going to some kind of psychological, counselor, because he had some anxiety over this whole thing, the missing time. And eventually, they were both pointed to Benjamin Simon, who is a psychologist, I guess, and he also does these hypnotic sessions with people, because they wanted and they thought that it might help them if they went through a hypnotic session. So Benjamin Simon had heard that they saw a UFO, and that he knew about Betty's dreams, about this, nightmarish being dealing with some UFO aliens. And he performed these hypnotic sessions on him, believing that this was some kind of delusion for both of them. But eventually, their stories seem to corroborate, and we find out that they were confronted by the UFO, and the UFO took them on board, did some kind of examination of them, and after being examined, they were released. And at one point, Betty was shown a star map, which she remembered during the hypnosis, and she did a reproduction of the star map. So after this took place, still the Hills had no real interest in this. They weren't interested in becoming UFO celebrities or something like that. They didn't pay much attention to it, but they felt that this hypnotic session was helpful. However, Benjamin Simon understood that when both Betty and Barney, especially Barney, were hypnotized to go back to this episode, they were both traumatized by this event. That he actually tried to hypnotize Barney that he wouldn't remember what was going on until he was ready to remember it, because it was obviously very traumatic. And he did an audio tape of Barney and Betty speaking as he was putting them through this hypnotic session. And somehow or other, this reporter named John Luttrell, he was a reporter for a newspaper, magazine, or something called The Traveler. He happened to hear this UFO account on tape that was being done by Simon of this Barney Hill. And he was immediately tried to get this onto his paper, and he made this whole report. And this is how the Hills became famous. They had not really wanted to step forward. But because of this reporter, then their whole story got blasted all over. And now a lot of people who follow the UFO phenomenon are aware of Betty and Barney Hill. And no one has really come forward to do any kind of realistic, debunking of this. During the time that they were in captivity, the aliens evidently pushed some needle into the navel of Betty, and she screamed in an agonizing pain. And one of the aliens, there were different aliens working together, they weren't all the same, waved his hand over her face, and she instantly didn't feel any pain. For Barney, he describes that he was terrified, and the alien told him to calm down, but he wouldn't calm down, and the alien said, "Close your eyes," and he felt the alien's eyes go into his mind. And in this way, finally, they pacified him, and they took them both aboard the ship, and they each were examined physically, separately from one another. What the aliens exactly were looking for, we don't know, but they took skin samples and other kinds of things. And eventually they showed Betty this star map, and they gave her a book, and she was going to take the book. But as she was getting off the alien craft, there was a kind of confrontation among the aliens, and they took the book back. But this whole account was, summed up in a book written by John G. Fuller later on called The Interrupted Journey, which is a story of the whole Betty and Barney the episode that they experienced. All right, so these are our particular case histories, and we can see that there are, as we were talking about before, traces, multiple witnesses, in some cases photos and videos. There was a famous episode in Mexico where literally hundreds of people saw the same group of crafts. And of course there was a famous Phoenix lights where people all over Phoenix saw it. Even the then governor of Arizona saw it. And he, of course, at that time he debunked it, but later on, now he's come forward saying that he wished that he hadn't. But at any rate, we see that all these things point to a group of enigmatic beings. Now, whether they're actually coming from another solar system, or another galaxy, or whether they're coming from our own planet, or whether they're coming from somewhere else, we don't know. But at any rate, they obviously have some kind of technology. And this phenomenon is part of a larger phenomenon that we've been talking about, that the human race is just one of many races that are humanoid in type. And we are interacting with many other groups of beings in this universe. And some of them are actually beings that have important duties to perform in organizing and maintaining the universe. And others are not, they don't have that duty, but they have their own agenda. And sometimes that agenda is not a very good one. So, all right. I'm going to break it here. And are there any questions or any realizations or ideas from any of you all? If you want, please use our little microphone there.
I wanted to point out that the circle, the dish, seems to be a predominant shape of the UFO craft.
Right.
Now, there are some, like the Phoenix lights, that appeared to look like a huge triangle.
Right.
And there are others that look like a cylinder or a cigar on its side, and there are some that look like a sphere, but mostly even the cylinders have a circular shape. So in my studies, and I'm sure it's written in the Vedas, as I studied the Old Testament and I read the book of Ezekiel, it opens up with the first few chapters about a wheel within a wheel.
Right.
This prophet, this visionary, was able to see a wheel within a wheel that was fiery in nature. And my question is there some definite connection with the manifestation of these UFOs? Do they have something to do with our state and present condition right now? Is there some kind of a link? Because there seems to be, there's lots of groups, New Age groups that are, so my question is there a link between our spirituality, our human spirit, with the UFO manifestation?
Mm-hmm. Well, the UFO phenomenon, generally, we usually think of it as being mechanical. It may not be the kind of mechanisms that we know in our modern science, and obviously they couldn't be, because we know how aircraft are designed, and our aircraft all use the same kind of propulsion and manipulation of wind. That's how all of our aircraft work, from helicopters to jets to prop-driven craft. But it all basically follows that same pattern. And obviously from the shapes of these UFOs, they're not aerodynamic in the way that would indicate that these crafts are flown as a result of manipulating air. They do something else. It's anti-grav or something else. Who knows what it is? Now, as we've been talking about, we are one of a whole number of races that are described in the Vedic literatures. And as you were saying, there's that section from the Old Testament where suspiciously it does sound a lot like some kind of UFO type of encounter. It might be an interdimensional kind of encounter as well, something else that's like that. In the Vedas, there's this section in the 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam where it talks about Shalva having an airship that flew in the sky and sometimes appeared to be more than one, sometimes consolidated into one form, sometimes appeared invisible, and was constantly changing its location and not steady at all. And he was using this to attack various Earth cities. Now, what we can get from this is also that generally those beings who use these mechanical craft are not the really spiritually advanced people. They may be somewhat neutral, but more than likely they're those kind of beings that have an ulterior agenda. And the actual more advanced beings don't need to use those kind of craft to get from one point to another. In fact, they can go from one place to another without any of that. And of course, when they arrive at a place, they're also able to shapeshift, so we wouldn't be able to detect them unless they wanted to make their physical presence known to us. But we do know that this whole overall scheme of having an off-world management system, which has been understood by human civilizations in many different places since time immemorial, that there are these beings that control the sun and the wind and so on and so forth. And this is coming from all different angles of our world, whether we're talking about Egypt or Greece, or we're talking about Scandinavia, or we're talking about China, or we're talking about Africa, or even the Americas or Polynesians. The same concept is there. Now, those people, they are managing the nature of the way that the universe works and unfolds. And generally, they don't connect with us very much anymore because we're not playing the game that the Vedas have described, where we offer them some kind of reciprocation and they then reciprocate with us. As we said, I think, a couple of weeks ago, that in the Vedas there's this idea, it explains it in the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita, that there's a system where we reciprocate with these engineers or manipulators of the universe, and then they reciprocate with us. Of course, we can bypass that whole system by just being completely dedicated to God. We don't need to mess with that system. But if you're not going to particularly have any kind of connection with God, well, then you better pay attention to that system, because otherwise you will be disturbed by various things that are happening. Hi. Otherwise you will be disturbed by what's going on there, and by the way that you are interacting with the world. Now, 5,000 years ago, that describes this in the 10th canto, there was a large accumulation of beings who are not the managers of the universe, not the demigods as we know of them. In the Vedic literature, they're called daityas, or demons, But what makes them interesting is that they are very powerful, just like the demigods are, but they are not interested in cooperating with the universal system, with the supreme being. Instead, they're interested in their own agendas. And like a Star Wars scenario, this group is fighting back and forth between certain planets that they inhabit and certain planets that the demigods, or the managers of the universe, they inhabit. And although the place they live is very opulent, the controls for the universe are not where they are. The controls are where the demigods are. So that's why they want to take over. And the earth plane is somewhere between the two. So between the heavenly plane and where the daityas live, between those two is the earth plane. And that's why this place is important for them, because it's their sort of foothold for their attack against the other thing. Of course, the Vedic literatures 5,000 years ago talk about how when the Supreme came, he removed them from the Earth planet. But they came back. And at that time, 5,000 years ago, they were doing the same thing that they're doing now. That they were infiltrating important families. They were infiltrating royal lines and leadership. They were able to change their form at will, and these things were talked about. And the Earth people in general at that time were not aware of what was going on any more than we are now. It's the same kind of scenario. Of course, the Supreme Lord has got the upper hand on everything. But that does not mean that necessarily we're going to have a good time of it. Because ultimately the way I like to put it is that Supreme Lord is operating the only gas station in town. Everybody's got to come get gas from him, no matter who you are. So if he wants to shut something down, it's no big thing for him. However, the material universe is not designed just for our happiness. It's also designed to give us hard lessons if we need them. So that's why, he allows these negative forces to get way out of control. Because according to how people are focused on spiritual life or not, is what is actually happening. So if the bulk of those who are trying, it doesn't even have to be a majority, even a small fractional minority of people serious about spiritual life, will create a situation where the Supreme Lord will take care of it in some kind of way, the overall picture. But if not, then we will all get nicely chastised by this whatever is coming down. And so this is kind of the way the overall picture works, that those who are flying around in these various crafts are those who are not going to do something particularly good for us by and large. And the demigods are watching the situation because they have a stake in the game too. And we're here kind of as, the unfortunate, aboriginals living on some island that the major countries are using as a staging platform for a larger scale attack, So we've got that going on. And of course, these beings, they use not only mechanical technology, the daichas or the demons, they use not only the, mechanical technology, but they also have subtle technology. They use the other kind, whereas the demigods, they don't need to use the mechanical technology at all. They can bypass it for the most part. Although they do have crafts that are visible, but their crafts are usually not, mechanically oriented. They're more ornamental. And so this is kind of the overall picture that the Vedas are presenting before us, that this has been going on since thousands of years. It's not a new phenomenon, but there's times where it comes to the fore and times where it recedes into the background. There are times where there's more and there's times when there's less. And overall, these beings have their own agenda, whatever it may happen to be, like doing these animal mutilations or doing these experiments with human genetics or whatever they're into. It's hard to tell, but it appears to be that's what one of their main themes of organizing things is. And for us, we're caught kind of in the middle. But if we understand what's going on, we can make progress one way or the other. We won't live forever anyways, no matter what the situation has, come good or come bad, Eventually we have to leave this world. But depending on whether there's a significant quantity of people in the material world here on the earth plane who are serious about spiritual life is depending on how the future will map out. Whether we get whacked in a big kind of, apocalyptic upheaval of some kind or another, or whether it doesn't happen that way. And we kind of go through some either whitewater or maybe just a gradual progression. But that's basically how I would describe, in a simple way, what the Vedas are actually telling us. Any other comments? All right. So this is What's Up With That? UFOs, Close Encounters. Today we talked about some specific case histories and about what makes them more believable, these various corroborating factors. And next session will be in January 9th, so we're not having anything on the 26th, and we're not having anything on the 2nd. So the January 9 will be the next session. There we're going to talk a little bit about the government cover-up and conspiracy angle of the whole UFO phenomenon. So thank you all very much. And we can continue to talk a little bit as I break down. And if some of you want, we can go over to take some free vegetarian food over across in the next block here at 25 First Avenue after this. Thank you all very much.